You're listening to Frontlines, a podcast for the people that truly make mountain biking happen. Not the riders, racers, or product designers, but the builders, advocates, and the often forgotten board members of your local mountain bike trail association. Last week, we introduced the topic of bikes in wilderness. And if you missed the episode and you're not familiar with the topic, I strongly encourage you to go back an episode and have a listen. If you did listen to the last episode, then you'll know that this is part 2 of our 3-part series. And before we get to this episode's interview, I came across something while reading last week that I wanted to share. It's from Robert Moore's book called On Trails, an Exploration. It's something that I thought was relevant to what we have and will continue to discuss for the next few episodes. Quote, "It may sound strange, even sacrilegious to some, but in a very real way, wilderness is a human creation. We create it in the same sense that we create trails. We do not create the soil or the plants, the geology or the topology, although we can and do shift these things. Instead, we delineate the place by defining its boundaries, its meaning, and its use." End quote. If you're interested in reading Robert Moore's book, then go to the brand new website, frontlinesmtb.com, and click on the book club page, where I'll be adding a new book every couple of months recommended by you. And this first recommendation comes from Christine Reed, previous guest and friend of the podcast, as well as the executive director of the North Shore Mountain Bike Association. If you're interested in purchasing any of the books that will be included in the Frontlines Book Club, then do so by clicking the book's cover on the website. From there, you can choose your format, including audiobook, or if you're like me, you can get an electronic version for your Kindle. And products purchased from links featured on frontlinesmtb.com will provide the show with a financial kickback through Amazon's affiliate program and will ensure the longevity of the show. Now, without any further delay, I'm your host, Brent Hillier, and this is episode 26 of Frontlines. The next 2 episodes of the show will be a little bit longer than most, and I'm confident that you'll agree that this topic is deserving of as much time as possible. And for those that weren't expecting a longer episode, there's always a pause button, but don't forget to come back and listen to the end. You'll want to hear all that my guest Eric Melson has to say. Eric is part of the Government Relations Department at the International Mountain Bicycling Association, or better known as IMBA. Hi, Eric. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Brent. How are you?
Good. So I really appreciate you joining me today. Some of my past guests have cited you as being a key resource for trail associations out in Montana and Idaho. And so prior to your current position, what was your previous role with IMBA?
So my previous role at IMBA was the Associate Region Director for Idaho, Montana, and parts of Wyoming. And in that role, I was working with about a dozen chapters around those 3 states, sort of providing them with the business resources, strategic planning resources, government relations and advocacy, federal planning process resources to essentially grow and support local mountain bike organizations that were affiliated with IMBA. And that ranged from a ton of different things, whether it was, board succession and growing a stronger board, to doing some long-term visioning and strategic planning, to getting in the weeds about a Forest Service planning process and how to navigate that and what relationships are needed and critical in the state offices to advance legislation that's friendly for mountain biking at the state level, and also working with congressional delegates on mountain bike positive legislation the national level. So I kind of ran the gamut.
To focus on the wilderness topic, one of the biggest examples of trail loss in wilderness to mountain bikers, and something that I think not just advocates out there are familiar with, but all mountain bikers, is the Boulder-Whitecloud area. And would you be able to just give us a little backstory?
Yeah, definitely. It's a long story, but I think it's a really important story to tell and to learn from. And just for some context for the listeners, like where the Boulder-Whiteclouds are, it's an area about 700,000 acres large, roadless land in central Idaho. It's north and east of Sun Valley and Ketchum, and it's like directly east of Stanley, Idaho. So right across the highway from the popular Sawtooth Mountains and wilderness area. It's a pretty spectacular landscape. Several major rivers start here, the East Fork of the Salmon, the Big Wood, the Big Lost. There's like 100 alpine lakes and over 150 peaks above 10,000 feet. And it's also home to the highest salmon spawning grounds in the lower 48. So it's a spectacular area, and it's loved by a lot of people. There's a ton of people that go there, and it's long been considered a premier recreation area, for hiking and backpacking and motorcycle riding and ATVs, mountain biking, snowmobiling, skiing, horseback riding, hunting, fishing. I mean, you name it. The Boulder-Whiteclouds provide a world-class recreation opportunity for a lot of people. There's also a lot of ranchers and cattle operators on the landscape as well. And several of those lessees, the leases go back 5 to 6 generations. So there's a ton of history, and it's sort of like it's a working landscape. From like a timeline standpoint, we really need to start in 1972. That's when the Sawtooth National Recreation Areas Act passed, and that created the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and Wilderness. Included in that bill, Congress also set aside half of the Boulder-Whiteclouds as part of that National Recreation Area. And that placed some restrictions on existing uses and also previous uses. And when you think about central Idaho in the context of natural resources, it's a very mineral-rich area. During the war efforts in the 40s, there was a lot of mining exploration, and that's actually one of the reasons that the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness was passed, was to prevent sort of a roughshod effort of mining exploration. And there's a ton of minerals in the area, molybdenum and tungsten and cadmium. And part of the reason why Congress decided to expand the boundary of the National Recreation Area in the Sawtooth into the Boulder-Whitecloud was to prevent mining. And Castle Peak, one of the trails that we'll talk about in a little bit, when you go over Castle Divide, there's actually a road that was punched in there way back in the day, and there's a landing pad where a mine was proposed to go in. So the 1972 Sawtooth National Recreation Areas Act prevented that from happening. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Congress back in 72 from keeping the area pristine. In the late 80s, early 90s, mountain bikers from Boise and Stanley and Ketchum and Salmon and Sun Valley all started to take their mountain bikes into the hills and explore the Boulder-Whiteclouds. And mountain biking became established in the area mostly on motorized routes, since motorbikes were being used back in there. Those were the trails that were being maintained, and that's what mountain bikers generally rode. So in the late 90s, Congressman Mike Simpson is elected. And one of the first things that he does is he kind of surveys the landscape in Idaho, and he wants to do something good. And he creates a collaborative working group to look at central Idaho economic development. And the Boulder-Whiteclouds are included in this landscape. And he crafts a bill called CEDRA, and it stands for the Central Idaho Economic Development and Recreation Act. And the collaborative included, in the beginning, stakeholders from the ranching community, from a conservation community, from local land owners and counties, and from the recreation community. Mostly at that time, it was the motorized folks, but snowmobilers were involved as well. So CEDRA's goal was to clarify and sort of solidify the current uses and remove any of the uncertainty. The biggest pressures in the collaborative were coming from the ranching community. They were worried that their leases were going to be terminated. And, the conservation community at the same time wanted additional protections in the Boulder-Whiteclouds, massive, 500, 700,000 acre roadless area that could be wilderness one day. And then the recreation community wanted access. So the motorized community, the snowmobilers, and at this point, the mountain bikers. Mining, again, extractive industries had an interest here. Those leases go all the way back to the 1872 mining law, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the landscape. So this bill aimed to sort of keep the landscape as it was, if not improve it, and get rid of that uncertainty. So Simpson introduces CEDRA in 2004. After many, many years of this roundtable collaborative discussion, the bill went nowhere. And it actually got reintroduced every single year from 2004 until 2013. So this bill has a 10-year legislative history, and it kept falling in the same sort of pattern. It would get introduced, maybe it would get a hearing, maybe it wouldn't get a hearing, and it would sort of die. It would not go anywhere. That was mostly because the collaborative groups just could never really come up with a 100% consensus-based decision. But Congress also didn't really have an appetite of passing wilderness in that time frame. The political stars really have to be aligned to pass a wilderness bill. And in the 10 years that Congressman Simpson was trying to get this bill passed, it just never happened. Around the last, iterations of CEDRA, the local chapter of IMBA, the Wood River Bike Coalition, started to get involved. The traction for CEDRA was gaining. There were more public meetings about CEDRA. I think at this point, Lindsay Slater, who is Congressman Simpson's staffer, said that there were over 200 public meetings. The mountain bikers started to get involved, and their interest was piqued. Well, what's going to happen to our trails back there? This is one of our favorite areas to ride. Like, this is some of the most iconic sort of backcountry riding in North America. We want to make sure that we have protections on our trails. So the Wood River Bike Coalition enters the fold 2012, 2013, and the collaborative expands to include a bunch of other interests. And as they're working this out, a strategy sort of emerges. President Obama had been designating national monuments on sort of a monumental scale, if you will, for lack of a better pun. But he had just gone on this tear of designating monuments all over the country. San Gabriel's, the Oregon Mountains, the Pacific remote islands, Browns Canyon, all said and done. Obama designated 33 monuments in his years in office, and there's momentum building behind this monument. CEDRA has never worked. Its legislative history shows that it's a failure. So there emerges this parallel track of a national monument, and the mountain bikers throw their support behind the monument because in a monument, whereas opposed to a legislative effort where in a bill you can see the language of what is in it, you get a very clear deal of what's been cut. In a monument, the president can use his executive order through the Antiquities Act to designate an area after citizens have shown that it's really important to them and they would like this area protected and preserved because of its cultural significance, its natural beauty, its scientific features. It's a citizen-led initiative, but the president has the power of authority to just authorize this area. So it's yet another path towards conservation. And within a monument designation, there's a management plan. There's sort of a second level to access. Monument gets designated, and then there's sort of a more work to be done on the management plan. But we entered into IMBA, and the Wood River Bike Coalition entered into a historic collaborative agreement with the wilderness groups. We signed an agreement with the Idaho Conservation League and with the Wilderness Society that said, we will work on this monument, and we agree to certain areas that should be preserved as wilderness, but we also agree to preserve the cherished mountain bike riding on Castle Peak and in Ants Basin. And in those discussions, we gave up trails so that we could have the long, big rides, Ants Basin and Castle Peak. We prioritized those with the local mountain bikers. Those are the iconic rides in the Boulder-Whiteclouds, the ones that you see all the pictures from. absolutely amazing rides. And I was really lucky to be able to ride them before they were taken away. So here we are. It's 2014, and there are meetings going on. Congressman Simpson is sort of disturbed about the efforts of this monument. He would rather have a bill. He would rather have language in a legislative package that you can see, that you can, touch. And the monument's really taking off. There's a ton of momentum behind it. All signs are leading toward the monument being designated. We have this agreement with the mountain bikers. It looks like our trails are going to be protected. And when Obama came to Boise, Congressman Simpson had a meeting with him and then John Podesta, and basically asked for 6 months. Give me 6 months to see if I can't get CEDRA to go through one more time. I need a little bit of time. I have a bill. I've been working on it forever. Let's pump the brakes on this monument. And the Obama administration agreed, but they gave him a deadline. So Simpson has 6 months. And what he ended up doing was working with Risch, another Idaho lawmaker, on this bill. Risch had basically held his support off and had actively worked against the bill in 2010. And when Risch came on board, it had more strength politically. And he met with the stakeholder groups one last time with an opt-in or opt-out option. So here's the final bill, and it no longer was called CEDRA. Now it was called the Sawtooth Recreation Areas Act. And are you in or are you out? And deals were cut in that process that mountain bikers weren't a part of. We could not get to the table. We were looked at as sort of the only group opposing the bill simply because we weren't politically powerful enough to have our interests looked at. So what ended up happening was this bill got the support of Risch and the groups, and it goes to Congress. And in record time, this bill flew through the halls of Congress and was signed several weeks later by President Obama. Now, this is 2015. So it left mountain bikers feeling used, I would say, because we had a better option. We had a 500,000 acre national monument that would have preserved the ecological integrity of the area. It would have allowed for a quiet, sustainable form of human-powered recreation. It would have been almost twice the size of this wilderness bill that went through that was so cut up and convoluted because the motorized community was able to negotiate boundary adjustments so that not a single one of their trails was closed to them. So instead of it being one contiguous area, now what you have when you look at the map is 3 different areas that are so contorted beyond recognition in order to keep all of these motorized existing routes open. And it's tragic because it's a step backwards in the evolution of public land management, in my opinion. We had a better option. The land would have benefited from a national monument. It would have protected the entire, most of the East Fork of the salmon watershed. It would have. There's just so many wins here. So it's really, it was really tough, honestly. A lot of the mountain biking community felt like we were the grease on the skids to get this wilderness bill passed. I feel like we did everything we could, but what it amounted to was a larger political machine where we, the mountain biking community, just could not scratch the surface of that process. Once that bill was moving, if you're on the bus, then you're on the bus, and we weren't on the bus. And it was really difficult to sort of oppose that bill off of the back end when we felt like we had a much stronger agreement. And, I'm sorry, like I feel like there's an apology owed to the mountain biking community, from me personally, and maybe it's appropriate from IMBA, but I think we did a really good job in this. This is a really important thing for us. I mean, we were able to touch lawmakers in ways that we never have been. And when we sort of picked up the pieces after, we were left sort of thinking, what could we have done better? And I don't know if we could have done anything better. there's a hidden strategy here, which I don't know if, the Idaho Conservation League and the Wilderness Society really, if they were leveraging a monument for a wilderness bill. That's what happened in Alaska with Anilka. They basically said, okay, well, if we're not going to get wilderness, we're just going to draw a bunch of monuments on the map, and the president's going to get these things passed. And what that resulted in was a wilderness package that got passed. So I don't know if there was a larger strategy there, but if there was, that's heartbreaking as well, because I'm a true believer in the fact that, the future of conservation involves recreation, and that mountain bikers and climbers and paddlers are, the young people that are experiencing these lands and that are going to become future advocates for them. And the conservation community continues to alienate those people, continues to want it their way, and not bend on some things where we have a better solution, like the monument in the Boulder-Whiteclouds. To have that rug pulled out from underneath you sucked, for sure. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, this process started back in 1972, as we've learned, and really, with Congressman Simpson introducing CEDRA in 2004, the mountain bikers weren't there. They weren't a part of the conversation until 10 years later. And was it too little, too late? I don't know. Was it the larger political, debate going on about President Obama designating a monument in a very conservative state? I think that played a huge hand, and it was a tough one to swallow for sure.
It's an incredible story, and it there's a few things in it. I think it highlights the importance of something like the Outdoor Alliance, making what is still a relatively small group. I mean, mountain bikers are not a huge percentile of the population, but when we combine ourselves with other outdoor groups, we increase that footprint for sure. We increase that push that we may have. And the politics of all of this is really interesting as well, because you take something that is unique when it comes to land use, national monuments coming from the executive branch. It's really the only time that I'm aware of that the executive branch of government is going to influence land boundaries like that as far as recreation goes. Normally we go through that slow process of going through Congress and or at a micro scale going through local municipal government, and that is people always use the term glacial, and I always think that's a little bit disrespectful, because glacial is a lot slower, but it's a slow process for sure. But then at the same time, this went very quickly. It flipped all of a sudden, and to do something in less than 6 months, and to push this through Congress. And you mentioned it was introduced first in when was it, 99?
I believe it was 99, but then there was a break, and from 2004 to 2013, CEDRA was introduced every single year. So I think it had a legislative history of more than a decade, with a dozen or more introductions.
Yeah, and then really to just come down to politics. And we always talk about how mountain biking is bipartisan, but this really was a political partisan move that happened. This was a Democratic president and a Republican kind of, in a lot of ways, butting heads by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to be fair to the conservation community, to the Wilderness Society and the Idaho Conservation League, they obviously want wilderness, and that's very, very transparent. So while the coalition that was built for the monument was very powerful and included mountain bikers and the Outdoor Alliance, and it seemed at that time that path forward was more viable, they never stopped working on the wilderness bill. And that, like, their ultimate goal is to get wilderness protected. So of course, when it came down to it and the bill gets introduced, they're going to testify positively, and they're going to ramp up their machine and support the wilderness bill however they can. What I think hurt in the relationships between those organizations and IMBA and the mountain biking community was that no olive branch in that, in the period of which the legislation was moving forward was extended. The coalition and the agreements that were made in the parallel track with the monument were abandoned. And they tucked tail and they ran. And they got behind the Wilderness Bill 100%. And it happened so quickly, we were sort of left, holding the monument coalition papers in our hand, like, what about this? And, it really shows long-term mountain bikers and recreationists, human-powered recreationists, I will argue, are the future of conservation. I think the era of pure wilderness bills, I think the nail in the wilderness bill coffin was just driven home with the Boulder-Whiteclouds. And in some ways, we'll see how this plays out in the future. But I think that the writing is on the wall for the conservation community to work with mountain bikers and the recreation community on the remaining roadless areas and coming up with solutions to protect them from development and extractive resources to, maintain that primitive experience and the essential biodiversity and the economic or the ecologic stability. I really do think that long-term strategy, the Wilderness Society missed out on this one. I think they wanted the immediate result of 300,000 acres, and that is a huge win for them. But the repercussions of that, I think, are coming back to bite them. They didn't realize what sort of waves that would create. They're now having to kind of clean up a little bit of that mess. So it'll be really interesting in the next decade to see how conservation and how land designations play out in this country, to see who's at the table, to see what those designations look like, what tools are being used. One thing that IMBA is really excited about right now is a bill that just got introduced before Congress broke for recess called the Recreation Not Red Tape Act.
And I want to know more about this Recreation Not Red Tape Act. But before we get to that, just moving forwards after the Boulder-Whiteclouds, what does the future look like? What lessons have we learned as mountain bikers?
There's the timeline for the Boulder-Whiteclouds. It's so long, and I want to make sure that's delivered in sort of an articulate and concise way, because it's really important, I think, that mountain bikers understand the history of the area, because we were late. We were late to the game, and we did what we could in sort of the 11th hour. But there was a lot of momentum behind CEDRA starting in the late 90s and the early 2000s where mountain bikers just weren't present. And I think that the teaching lesson there is you never know when the next Boulder-Whiteclouds is going to happen. And you have to have the relationships, your ear to the ground, the positive working interactions and relationships with your land managers and your local county commissioners. And I can't stress enough how a positive reputation and, a really positive solution-oriented look on land management with mountain biking goes. I think mountain bikers for the longest time have shown up late. And when we realize that our trails are threatened, we hit the nuclear option. We try and blow up the process or get to the table, and we're fighting for scraps. And it shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think the proactive solutions are staying engaged, knowing how to navigate the planning process and the political process, and just being kind and understanding that you're not going to get everything you set out for, and you should be okay with that. Other people aren't going to get what they want either. If you get 80%, you're doing pretty damn good. If you get 50%, you're doing okay. And that's just the reality of it. I think we have become so ingrained with trail loss that we expect it. And that's a horrible thing, fighting for the status quo just to preserve the trail access that we have right now seems ridiculous. It's 2017. We should be fighting for, additions to wilderness in areas where it doesn't affect us, and additions to trail systems where we want those things. And the conservation community should be our leading partner in helping us get those things. And I think everything has just become so politically driven, and so there's just these wedges that get driven between us that don't need to be there. Meanwhile, we feel like a bronze level supporter. Like, we're always just sort of held off until the end and never, a full partner, never trusted. And, they'll ask for our support when it benefits them, but we're just this bronze level sort of younger brother. And they're like, okay, that's really great that you want to support this and that you want to work with us, but just let us do it. We're here, the guardians of the galaxy. We have the keys to the landscape. We do this as a profession. And I just really hope that, if there are anyone from the Wilderness Society or from the conservation community, that they sort of realize that we're here and willing to work with them. We're willing to put in as much effort as they are, but we need to be invited, and we have to build that trust up. And that's the trust, in my opinion, was kind of shattered in the Boulder-Whiteclouds, and that's where that long-term strategy comes into play. Is they could have stuck out an olive branch and said, the mountain bikers have been working on this really hard. We should work with them on this wilderness package. But they cut ties, and they basically threw us under the bus. And to me, the long-term strategy there is going to bite them in the ass. I mean, we're seeing the repercussions of that with the Sustainable Trails Coalition and their bills that have been introduced. I guarantee if the Boulder-Whiteclouds had more favorable results to mountain bikers, if we were able to preserve Ants Basin, Castle Divide, if we were able to make that a success story, the Sustainable Trails Coalition wouldn't exist right now, guaranteed. But that was the match. That was the match that lit the dynamite. And they've been extremely successful in rallying their base and getting people, to write congressmen. And they've got a bill. They have two bills. That's a real world repercussion of what happens when you decide to take the short end run and not think long term. And that's their mess that they have to clean up now. That they have to deal with that. They're now spending a lot of money and resources to lobby against the Sustainable Trails Coalition bill. So, yeah, I mean, with every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. And I think that they got, glossy-eyed and excited about the possibility to add 300,000 acres of wilderness when they could have had 700,000 acres of national monument. And talk about the conservation benefit. The motorized community didn't lose a single trail. The reason why there are 3 different wilderness areas in the Boulder-Whiteclouds are because the motorized community cut a deal with Senator Risch to allow for all of their routes to remain open, and that made corridors between the 3 wilderness areas. So you tell me what's better for the wilderness and the wilderness experience: human-powered bicycles that are quiet, or motorcycles that are able to go in between 3 wilderness areas that are much louder and destructive to the trails. It just seems to me like the mountain biking community was sort of patted on the head and was like, nice try, but you're not politically powerful enough to actually influence this. Though when the buck comes to stop, it's disheartening. But at the same time, that's the bed that they made, and some people are happy with it and some people are really pissed with it. And there's a lot of theories as to what that means to wilderness moving forward. Like I said, I think personally that the era of wilderness bills is over. I think that the Boulder-Whiteclouds put that nail in the coffin, and it's rallied mountain bikers nationwide around the issue. And never have mountain bikers been so organized to be opponents to wilderness as they have been right now. They created this problem, So yeah, we're going to push back on future wilderness bills if it affects us. And now we have, a new crop of people that are more interested in the wilderness debate. The sustainability of the Sustainable Trails Coalition community is effective in social media and rallying their base. And I can imagine that if there's ever another wilderness bill that's introduced, it's going to be met with even more opposition from the mountain bike community than it has in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see the perceptions of a lot of mountain bikers out there, that there's definitely the incorrect perception that STC is a competing organization with IMBA, like it's going to replace IMBA, and it's
Right.
when you dig into it, it's not anything like IMBA at all. It's a one topic kind of group, and really, if they can get their way, that's the end of the group. It's not something, IMBA is day in, day out, constantly there, making sure that we aren't late to any of these issues and any of these problems, where STC is not like that at all. But there's also this kind of this discussion that it's one or the other, that you support one or the other. And is there, like, if STC were to get their way, is there going to be negative repercussions for mountain biking?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And actually, to follow that question with a question, and something that I've asked, members of the Wilderness Society and these state-based wilderness groups is, in this parallel universe, let's assume the STC is successful, that their bill passes. What is the conservation community's response? Do they now accept mountain bikers, the millions of mountain bikers that are out there willing to do trail work, and invest in more conservation efforts to maybe expand, double, triple the number of wilderness acres? You remove a barrier to wilderness like that, and now they've become supporters. Does the conservation organizations, does the conservation community accept that? Do they just say, okay, nice game, mountain bikers, welcome to our world, let's work together? That's a really interesting question. I've thought a lot about that. Or is it the curmudgeon-y old guard that is like, I can't believe this, and they never want to shake hands and play in the same sandbox together? They're like, their nose goes up and they're like, oh, our pristine experience is ruined forever. We'll never work with you. And if I ever see you out there, I'm just going to shake my walking stick at you or whatever. It's a really interesting thought experiment. Does it benefit mountain bikers? For sure. I think there's a ton of trail that's worthy of mountain biking within wilderness areas. Do I think, personally, mountain bikes should be allowed in the existing wilderness areas? No, I don't. I would actually hate to see that for a number of reasons. I think, this is me talking, this is my personal feeling on this. If I had a perfect world, the areas that are currently designated wilderness stay wilderness, no wheels, and that's what wilderness is. We create a new designation in areas where mountain bikes have become established, because in a lot of these areas, Boulder-Whiteclouds not being one of them, mountain bikes were never ridden in a ton of these areas. Some of them are extremely rugged. Remember, wilderness is a lot of times rock and ice. It was kind of the leftover landscapes that couldn't be logged when we were nation building, when we were expanding and settling the West. All of the good timber went first. The rivers were dammed. The remaining lands that were really hard to get into or didn't have much economic value were created as wilderness. And since then, we've sort of put different parameters around that. But from a timeline standpoint, mountain bikes didn't get established in a lot of the original wilderness areas and haven't been established in those areas since, the Whiteclouds being one of those exceptions, and maybe some other areas in the Southwest that have been designated. But for the most part, we've never really ridden in those areas. And I know other people will counter that with the STC philosophy, and that's fine. We can argue that all you want. But in my personal philosophy, this national recreation areas designation, or it needs to be stickier. It needs to be like, backcountry designation, something that's cool, something that we can get behind, like wilderness. National recreation area might not be the appropriate title, but we come up with like a backcountry designation that is the exact same thing as wilderness. No jet boats, no airplanes, no any of that. but you can ride mountain bikes there. It's human powered and quiet. No snowmobiles, no dirt bikes, none of that. It'd be like a category 1B, I think, in the international scale, but it would allow mountain bikes. And Canada has that, like the Chilcotins. I just rode in that area. I mean, that's one of the reasons I went up to the Chilcotins, was to experience that. It's a wilderness park. All of the signs in the Chilcotins use the word wilderness. It's the exact same rules apply, except you can ride your bike there. And it just felt so right, Brent. Like, I was just like, yes, like, this is what it should feel like. I don't feel like an outlaw. I don't feel like I have to ride this area now because I fear that it'll be ripped away from me in the future. Like, I can keep going back to the Chilcotins and keep, bonding with that area, keep making lasting memories with that area, ride all those trails, like admire the geology and like the topography. I mean, all of it is just, that's why I go there, like huge 9-hour rides with 10,000 feet of elevation gain and loss. That's like that. And it just feels so right. It just feels so right. And I don't know. Sometimes I just think, well, we should just grandfather bikes into future wilderness. Maybe that's the appropriate path, is we don't mess with the Wilderness Act. We don't, like the STC model is flawed, and we should just work on grandfathering bicycles into trails that they already have established. Like, jet boats are allowed on the Salmon River, and there are old airstrips that, public airstrips that you can land on in Idaho. There are tons of grandfathered things in lots of wilderness areas. The inconsistency to me is, I think, the biggest headache. Like Anilka in Alaska National Land bill that effectively doubled the wilderness acreage. It added a loads of, I can't remember the exact acreage, but it essentially doubled the number of acres, but it allowed snowmobiles and landing of aircraft and fish hatcheries and a mine. All of that those are compromises that were made in order to get, 40,000 acres, whatever it was, of wilderness. So, if those kinds of deals are to be cut, and if those are watermarks along the way, I'd like to see a wilderness bill grandfather mountain bikes in on a trail where it's been established. I think there's a ton of creativity here. It's just, we're willing to do that. We are totally willing to get into the weeds and come up with these really fun, creative solutions that work. It's just the other side oftentimes doesn't want to play ball. Like, it's wilderness or nothing for them. And I think that's a bummer. I think that's a bummer for a number of reasons, man. I mean, it's the human construct, for one. You're trying to tell me that the framers of the Constitution were smarter than Howard Sonnheiser? The Constitution was written so that it could be amended. If it didn't work for the current generation, it should be crumpled up and thrown out the window and rewritten so that it works for the people in the present day. And that has been done. Like, we have amended our Constitution many, 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 many times. And this sacred document that people have held on to, this Wilderness Act, is it's almost like they're creating their own hailstorm that's coming down the road. So I don't know. I can go on and on and on about this, Brent, but I'll shut up for now because obviously I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, well, and I think maybe the word wilderness makes a lot of people impassioned about it. I think maybe if you don't have trail loss next to you, or maybe if you even don't have a wilderness area next to you, when you think of wilderness, you think of, so that sounds like a great place to go ride your bike. And I've heard this argument from a lot of people where what we think is wilderness, for those of us that might not live next to it, we just think that, well, where I go ride my bike is the wilderness. Of course I want to go ride my bike in wilderness, but we're talking about rugged areas. And when you look at, when you explore something like Trail Forks and you look at the trails that are out there and you add that land manager, that land use layer to the map, there's obviously no trails in wilderness on Trail Forks, but then you bring up that heat map and there's no people riding in wilderness on the heat map, there's really, like, you can see how trails just skirt the edges of them. They go around them. There's not that, even when you go onto something like Strava, there's not heat maps blowing up in wilderness areas. There's not people riding in
Right.
these places. But the word wilderness sounds like something that would be great to go ride in.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, I agree. I think that the connotation that goes with the word wilderness is endearing, and it's alluring. Like, people want to, yeah, it's a great word. It's a great, I mean, it totally, it's misconstrued in a lot of ways, and it's somewhat subjective to your own, personal experiences and what you value and what you would call wilderness. I mean, people in the East, where there's not a whole lot of wilderness, congressionally designated capital W wilderness, does that mean that they don't have a primitive, unconfined, natural experience when they're in a park or even, a little undeveloped patch of land outside their house? Like, the Wilderness Act was written vaguely, intentionally. It took 40 years to define what wilderness character is. And if you read the act, it reads like poetry. I mean, it is a beautiful act. I mean, it is, I almost have it memorized. And it's an astonishing piece of legislation that is very progressive, and I think essential. I mean, I really do think it is essential. But at the same time, it was written in a way that left a lot of things undefinable. And, scientists and the scholars had to pick apart the act to figure out, what are they getting at here? What are they really trying to say? Like, with, primitive and unconfined and untrammeled. The word untrammeled is in the Wilderness Act, which, means unshackled. There's a lot of unique words in there, and in combination, there's a document out there that's actually called Managing for Wilderness Character that was written in 2004, I believe, by Peter Landris and the guys at the Aldo Leopold Research Station. And they define what wilderness character is. There are 4 qualities to wilderness character. And I mean, think about that for a minute. Like, scholars took 40 years to define what wilderness character is, so that land managers can manage for those things, so that we have some way to see, are we positively managing for wilderness character? Are we negatively managing for wilderness character? Are these areas getting wilder? Or are they getting less wild? Why? And there's a whole institutions built on wilderness management and teaching wilderness management. And it's fascinating once you get into the weeds with it all. But at the same time, it's like, when you have to break it down into those individual components, and define each, nut and bolt that's in the act itself, to get a better sense of why the act was written and for what purposes. Mountain bikes, obviously, and recreation were never really a part of that equation. The juxtaposition here is that recreation is the conduit to experience wilderness. Without hiking or horseback riding or a float plane or a raft or a kayak or backcountry skis, you can't experience these landscapes. It's a museum without doors or windows. And if that's what the hardcore wilderness community wants, then let's designate that as a research science area and ban humans. Let's actually make it a scientific polygon on the map that no one can go into strictly for, the biocentric reasons, or the ecocentric reasons. And Russia has this. There are a lot of places, UNESCO heritage sites, where you just can't go. And I'm fine with that. I think that's totally fine. I think we should have carbon sinks in areas where grizzly bears should do whatever the hell they're going to do, and wolverines and, spawning salmon. I think we should not fuck with a lot of these places, personally. But to categorically exclude a group of people based on ideology, that's the sticking point. It's like someone arbitrarily at some point said, okay, we're going to draw the line here, and that's that. And it feels unfair to a lot of people. At the same time, I mean, I feel like I'm wishy-washy here on this because a lot of my language here is like you would assume that I want bikes in wilderness areas, right? With the way that I'm talking like this, but I don't, mainly because I worked on wilderness trails for about a decade, and I know what the wilderness trails are like in Idaho and Montana, and they're not suitable for mountain bikes. Not at all. Like maybe of the 2,000 miles of trail that are in, the Frank Church, 10 or 12 miles would be great for a mountain bike. And maybe some people are okay with like hopping over a lot of logs, thousands of logs, and having trails that haven't been maintained in decades and having to route find. And to me, that's not a good mountain bike experience. I mean, to me, a good mountain bike experience is like going to Canada and riding purpose-built mountain bike trails that are challenging, that also have great views, that give me up to the Alpine, all of those things combined. But there's actually some flow and some fun and some features that are built with mountain bikes in mind. Like, I'd much rather ride those trails than jump over logs and get lost. And I don't know. It's an interesting juxtaposition, man. It's super interesting.
Definitely. So on July 26, Ron Wyden, a Democrat senator from Oregon, and Representative Rob Bishop, a Republican from Utah, introduced the Recreation Not Red Tape Act to Senate. Now, what is Recreation Not Red Tape?
It does a number of things. This is the second iteration of Recreation Not Red Tape. So yeah, you'd mentioned a senator, Democratic senator from Oregon, that's Senator Ron Wyden, and Representative Rob Bishop, who is a Republican from Utah. They've introduced this bill, and it does a lot of things. It deals with outfitting permits. It deals with recreation in the mission of agencies that typically don't have it. For example, obscure land management agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, sometimes they manage dams, or like the Bureau of Reclamation, where there'll be a large-scale civil engineering project, but there'll also be a small park next to that project. They manage the lands around those areas. Those agencies don't have recreation in their mission. So that would lead to increased partnerships with new agencies, potential new trail development opportunities, which is really cool because there's a ton of these areas out west and out east as well. The biggest thing that the mountain biking community should be aware of, and the biggest draw for IMBA, is the Recreation Not Red Tape establishes a bike-friendly system of national recreation areas. It would grandfather in 26 current recreation areas, and it would create a process to inventory and recommend lands for future additions to a national recreation areas system. So it's really similar to how the Wilderness Act works. So the Wilderness Act of '64 was what we call an enabling piece of legislation. So what that did was it created a national wilderness preservation system. So it creates a framework for how to inventory and recommend lands to be included as wilderness. And that starts with the agencies. So when there's a planning process or like a forest plan revision, the agencies look at every acre of land within that forest or that range. And they look at the acres that are suitable for timber harvest and that are critical for habitat, that are suitable for recreation. And they also look at lands that are suitable for wilderness. So there's a process that the agency goes through to inventory those acres and then recommend those acres to be included as wilderness. And then from that standpoint, once that forest plan has been approved and signed and put into effect, that's sort of the foundation for future wilderness legislation. So if a conservation organization really wants to get some acres of wilderness, they look to the forest plan first, and they look to the polygons where recommended wilderness already exist. So now let's talk about the Recreation Not Red Tape Act. This is the exact same process that would follow suit, but under the recreation lens. So right now, the agencies are not mandated to inventory and recommend lands for recreation. They do that for wilderness. What we're trying to accomplish here is getting the agencies to inventory and recommend lands that are high quality lands for recreation, for non-motorized recreation, for motorized recreation. So essentially this would create a future designation. There is a current national recreation areas designation, but it's actually, there's no consistency there. There's really no guidelines to creating a national recreation area. And this would create that framework to have those acres looked at under a recreation lens, recommended to become national recreation areas. And then in the future, if there's a legislative proposal, we have that administrative framework, the acres on the map that have gone through that administrative process to then recommend those areas as a higher level conservation management area or a national monument or any number of protective designation that is bike friendly. So this is it's pretty close to, mountain bikers fantasize about wilderness B, like wilderness plus bikes. This is about as close to that as we've ever gotten. And considering that both of these lawmakers sit on their natural resource committees, and Rob Bishop is actually the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, which is, he gets to introduce these pieces of legislation. He gets to decide which ones move forward, which ones will get a hearing. To have him co-sponsoring this bill is extremely important because it sets this bill up for a higher degree of success. So, yeah, it's a super exciting time for us. We've been working on this for years through the Outdoor Alliance Coalition. It's not just IMBA on its own, but this is yet another example of this coalition of national human-powered recreation groups that are, standing up for the places that we love to play, wanting to protect them in perpetuity, and making sure that the access that we currently have is preserved or enhanced.
Yeah, this seems like a really proactive solution. So a land manager like the Forest Service, for example, is going to be able to recommend a space for recreation, and instead of potentially recommending that space for wilderness, and then the fight begins to kind of adjust that and change it. It kind of really sets us up for success.
Yes, it does, and it builds the framework for future success. I mean, you have to play within the rules, right? You have to play the cards that you're dealt, and this is a hand that we're playing that will, I think, advance recreation on public lands. It'll put not a priority, but it will elevate the landscapes that are already being used. It'll make them more consistent. It'll make the management of them more consistent. And it's definitely a proactive play, which in this Congress and in this administration is something that's really unique and challenging at the same time. But there's not a whole lot of momentum moving conservation of public lands forward right now. I think there's a lot of emphasis on defending what we have as, the administration keeps fulfilling positions in the USDA, in the Interior. We still don't have a clear picture of what their goals and intents are. We know that energy development is a priority. Secretary Zinke has said that. This administration's made it pretty clear that they want America to be energy dominant on the global scale, and that means, extracting resources. And I say this to chapter leaders and to mountain bikers all the time, like, all the access in the world is meaningless if the experience is horrible. Like, we could have all the trails that we want, but if they're winding through oil derricks and clear cuts and subdivisions, what's the point? And maybe some people are okay with that. I personally am not, but I'm also a Westerner that's lived in, Western states my entire life. I've grown accustomed to backcountry trails and that sort of, more wild experience. I love stacked loops, but my passion is riding in the backcountry. And yeah, I don't want those things. I don't think mountain bikers in general want those things. I think it's pretty clear that we are conservation minded. We do need to push back on the experiences that we want to have. Like we need to defend the experiences that we want to have, I guess I should say. And these proactive strategies like this legislation is one way to do it. A shout out to Ron Wyden and Rob Bishop. Thank you. If you live in Oregon or Utah, send these guys an email and thank them. I know it's kind of weird given Rob Bishop's background and some of his intentions for public lands, but they could use the support right now. And if you live in another state that has a senator or a congressman or congresswoman that are recreationists, set up a meeting, send an email or call their office aide and see what they think about this bill and see if they'd be willing to co-sponsor. We're looking for new co-sponsors always. The more sponsors we have on this bill, especially from both sides of the aisle, the stronger it's going to be moving. This is a chance for mountain bikers to really step up and support a piece of legislation that would turn the tides. This is a watermark. If we can get this passed, this is going to positively impact mountain biking for decades, generations to come. I mean, this is a really, really important piece of legislation. So.
That's great. And I think we should end this on a positive note, because I think that's great news for all mountain bikers out there. And Eric, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me and to share this with us.
Hey, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on Frontlines. I think what you guys are doing here is amazing, and yeah, really grateful to be able to share my experiences and my thoughts. So thanks, Brent.
I feel like something that should be noted in this argument, and Eric brought it up, backcountry trails are just one type of mountain bike experience. And for him, that's what defines mountain biking. And as mentioned by others, including on this show, mountain bikers are not just one group. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't help each other protect whatever each of us defines as mountain biking. Eric mentioned that if you lived in Oregon, then you should email Senator Ron Wyden, and if you live in Utah, then email Congressman Rob Bishop. Included in the show notes are links to their contact pages and Twitter and Facebook pages, respectively. You'll also find links to IMBA, and like always, a link to donate and support the show via PayPal. In order to ensure that this podcast can continue these discussions and future ones, I rely on donations from listeners like you. As a follow-up to the Wilderness episode, I'll be including feedback at the end of episode 28. And if you want to add your thoughts, concerns, or perspective, then send me an email or an audio file at frontlinesmtb@gmail.com. And I really want to know where you stand on this topic. You can also find the show Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at FrontlinesMTB. And if you haven't already, give those accounts a like or a follow, share them with your friends and fellow advocates. And while you're at it, leave a review and rating on iTunes. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It helps others find the show. Next episode will be my interview with the president of the Sustainable Trails Coalition, Ted Stroll. And during our discussion with Eric, he mentioned a recent trip that he made to the Chilcotins. And we'll be hearing from Naheed Henderson, Director of Communications and Development at Tyax Adventures. Among other things, Tyax is a backcountry mountain biking outfitter, and they drop clients into the remote wilderness of British Columbia's Coast Mountain by float plane in the middle of a provincial park. We'll hear how wilderness and mountain biking can coexist together. Announced at the end of September is the newly appointed chapter representation on the IMBA board, Ernie Rodriguez. Ernie is the president of the very successful Mid-Atlantic Off-Road Enthusiasts, also known as MORE, in the Virginia area. We're excited to hear that news. Intro music is once again by Lee Rosevear, and this week our outro music is performed by Eric Bruce. And like always, production notes by Jennifer Pride. This month we lost Tom Petty, and I thought it would be a fitting tribute to change up the outro of the show. So here's a cover of a classic performed by Eric Bruce. I've included a link to Eric in the show notes. Big thanks to him for letting us use the track. So this song goes out to the Albury Wodonga Mountain Bike Club and the Fraser Valley Mountain Bikers Association, and all other organizations who are working their butts off to either gain access or keep access to their trails. So like always, I'm Brent Hillier. This is Frontlines. Thanks for listening, and happy trails.
Well, I